Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
California's rugged and scenic northwestern corner is the beginning of the great Pacific Northwest. A region of untamed and primitive beauty.
And the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department has now joined efforts with the Arcata Police.
Growers living off the grid. Humboldt County also has the highest rate of missing person cases in the state. 60% of marijuana is grown in the United States.
There's a lot of evil here. A lot of evil.
This is Kinda Murdery, and you're entering the Emerald Triangle. Wow, that was nuts. Hey everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. Today we bring you a story discovered in the Mendocino Beacon on Saturday, April 18th, 1936. But the origins of this mysterious tale date back many years earlier to a haunted logging town near the border of Humboldt and Mendocino counties, and its ill-fated sawmill frozen in time. I'm eager to share with you the cursed history of Henry Neff Anderson Sr. and the ghost town of Andersonia that still bears his name. But before I do, I need to introduce you to my guests today. It is my honor and my privilege to inform you that sharing the microphone with me today are none other than Kentucky Bluegrass Blue Bloods of horror and haunting, the Duchess and Duke of spirits and spooks, the king and queen of all creepy things, the president and first lady of the United Paranormal States of America. It's Jerry and Tracy Paulley from Hillbilly Horror Stories. Hey, how are you two doing?
Go ahead, babe.
Oh, you could have just.
I'm sorry. Well, we're doing great. We're so used, I'm sorry, we're so used to being in the same room together.
It's my fault for doing that to you, sorry.
No, that's okay, honey. Thank you for having us. We're just an honor to be on your show.
Well, it's absolutely an honor to have you.
And that's got to be one of the most advanced introductions we've ever had.
Thank you. Gosh, if you hear a little frog in my throat at any point during the show, I apologize. I am recovering from a cold, luckily not COVID as far as I know. I tested negative, but it's been a little bit of a journey. Of course, you guys are the hosts of the wildly popular Hillbilly Horror Stories. Can you tell us a little bit about Hillbilly Horror Stories, what type of stories you tell, what you're up to, how the show got started, basically anything you want to tell us?
Well, the show has evolved a lot. We're getting ready to celebrate our 6-year anniversary in August. And the show initially started out with me and a friend of mine, a gentleman by the name of Ricky. And it was about 20-minute episodes on, it was supposed to just be Southern ghost stories, thus the term Hillbilly Horror Stories. And it was a little more adult, we should say. I had Diane from History Goes Bump. She kind of coined it as it sounded like two guys in a bar talking about ghosts. And that was pretty accurate, I'd say. Wouldn't real child-friendly, we'll say. And eventually, after 8 or 10 episodes, we decided that really wasn't working as much as we wanted. And Tracy became the co-host. We became a little more friendly for families and for work. And that's kind of how it started. And we eventually started covering stories from all over the world. So it's not just Southern stories anymore. No need to change the name. So we kept it. People liked it. And I'd say today it's really evolved because we went from doing one story a week on Sundays to interviewing some of the hottest names in the paranormal field to doing basically 6 episodes a week now. We do our classic show on Sunday. But then we do a couple of other more scripted shows because our show is conversational. Tracy never knows the story. So when we do the story, she's hearing things for the first time and she has a natural reaction like a lot of our listeners would have. She asks a lot of the questions that they would ask. And that's kind of been our success to the show, I think, is the fact of our chemistry together. Being married obviously helps. And I tried to get Ricky to marry me. He didn't want to, so his loss. And I think that's when the show went to the crapper. But no, I think that's the key. But I know people like other things. So like I said, we do 6 episodes a week. We do one that's basically listener stories. We call it Eerie Encounters, and I just read it with a little bit of music behind it. We have one called Macabre Misfortunes that we do on Saturday, which is just a shorter version of what we do on Sunday show. So it's on. If you like Sunday show, the format, it's the same thing, except it's usually a story that's got some tragedy involved with it. And it's not always paranormal. We've done a plane crash where the plane was missing for 50 years and turned up and things like that. So it gives us a little more flexibility on that one. But yeah, if you got something for everybody if you tune in Tuesday through Sunday.
That's all fantastic stuff. And let me just say that thank goodness Tracy came on board, because I'm a big fan of the show, obviously, and I can't imagine the show without you, Tracy. You so often just sort of have the perfect aside or insight.
No.
Shall we jump into today's story?
Sure.
Sure.
All right. As I mentioned at the top, this is the story of the haunted and cursed history of the lumber ghost town, Andersonia. Now, Andersonia is located just off the 101 North, about 5 miles from Percy, California, near the South Fork of the Eel River. In order to tell you the whole story of Andersonia, I have to begin with the story of the man it's named after. The founder of Andersonia, Henry Neff Anderson Sr., which brings me to the classic inquiry for all tales of woe, the need to understand the victim. And so I ask, who was Henry Neff Anderson Sr.? Henry Anderson, known affectionately as Pap Anderson, was born in 1839. He was a forward-thinking fellow with an eye for opportunity, and by 1878, he was a timberman in the great state of Michigan. Home to last week's guest, Nick View from the Traditional Outdoors podcast, and I know many other fine Michiganders. Guys, I'm always looking for an excuse to say the word Michigander because I enjoy it so much. And I have to ask you two, I take it that someone from Kentucky is obviously called a Kentuckian, but are there any other names maybe that Kentuckians use amongst themselves that not everybody would know about? Got any other nicknames for each other depending on where you're from, or any behind-the-curtain Kentucky monikers?
No, but there's some where if you're like in the Louisville area and you're close to, there's Southern Indiana is right across the bridge there, so people go back and forth. Mm-hmm. That's kind of considered Kentuckyanians.
Okay, there you go.
So, but that's not used very often, to be honest with you. But
now, is there,
other than that,
much like with Wisconsin and Illinois, is there no love lost between Kentucky and Indiana, or do you guys get along pretty well?
I don't think we get along with anybody. Kentucky and Indiana, Kentucky and Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia.
Louisville especially.
Yeah, we have the inner city rivals, like the fact that Kentucky, you got Louisville and Lexington that just can't stand each other, just mainly for sports reasons, but it bleeds over into everything
Yeah, I
else.
imagine that's because the Wildcats out of Lexington and the Cardinals out of Louisville are such good basketball teams, right?
Usually, but it carries over into lacrosse and anything else you could factor in.
Boy, you guys must have loved all the Rick Pitino stuff then, I imagine. That was super entertaining. My goodness.
Yeah, never a dull moment, that's for sure.
Wow. I never knew that's what an Italian restaurant was for. My goodness.
Well, that's the difference between Rick Pitino and John Calipari. Is John Calipari is really good with public relations, and Rick Pitino is really good with relations in public.
That's good. Yeah, man, I thought it was scandalous when Michael shot the police commissioner in the Italian restaurant in The Godfather, but
right.
Rick Pitino took it to a whole nother level.
Oh yeah, he's a lover, not a fighter.
There you go. Yeah. All right. So, well, on that note, let's jump back into the tale of Pap Anderson here. So, as the Michigan timber industry grew, Pap moved to the town of Greenville, Michigan, and there he spent 20 years. Now, as I mentioned, he was a forward-thinking man with an eye for opportunity, and around the turn of the 20th century, there was no greater lumber El Dorado than the Great Pacific Northwest, home to the Emerald Triangle and the stories you hear on this season of Kinda Murdery. Well, if someone like me can see opportunity in the great looming dark forests of the Pacific Northwest, you can bet that sharp-eyed businessman and burgeoning logger baron Pap Anderson wasn't about to miss out. Pap's carpe diem moment, his opportunity to venture into the shadows of the ancients and seize upon the shady green gold awaiting him in the untouched old-growth redwood forests of the Pacific Northwest. His door to destiny was unlocked by tragic misfortune. Not, mind you, Pap's misfortune, but rather that of another timberman named J.M. Weatherwax. Side note, great name, Weatherwax. I wouldn't mind borrowing that surname for a day or two. All right. If Pap had seen foreshadowing rather than opportunity, perhaps he would never have ventured west of the Michigan woods. But he made his fortune by recognizing rich business opportunities, not by scrying grim omens. And so, when J.M. Weatherwax, pioneer of Gray's Harbor and sawmill operator, died in 1898, Pap Anderson bought his mill in Aberdeen, Washington, where he founded Anderson and Middleton Lumber, alongside his three sons, Sam, Hal, and Ed, and his son-in-law, Bert Middleton. Now, Pap Anderson's opportunity to stake claim to the rich Washington woods arose out of the death of someone else. But opportunity born from calamity doesn't always appear at another's expense. You know, Jerry, Tracy, I've found in my life that sometimes things happen that seem like an absolute disaster when you're in the middle of it. But then later on down the road, you realize that wonderful things that have happened wouldn't have been possible without going through that seeming disaster first. I guess that's why there's the saying, it's always darkest before the dawn. But I wanted to ask you guys if there are any examples in your own lives of things you did or things that happened to you that felt like an utter catastrophe when they were happening, but that you now can see have led to something overwhelmingly positive.
Well, I would obviously say my divorce, my divorce from my first wife, because that definitely seemed like a calamity at the time. And it was the darkest part of my life. And now my life is pretty great. And I have a wonderful wife. And, I could never have foreseen my life being where it is now. I'm as happiest that I've ever been in my life. And I couldn't have seen that 20 years ago.
And I know you guys do a lot of work around causes for mental health and suicide prevention and also for veterans causes. And do you feel like your desire to be in those outreach and charitable areas was born out of anything that happened to you in your life?
Oh, I think without a doubt. I think once you've been to that point, you have a whole different outlook on what it's like. I know when before any of this happened, depression was something I had never dealt with, never understood depression. You know, I was one of those people that would say, well, I mean, if you're depressed, just get up and do something, work it off, It's like getting, hit with a baseball. Just walk it off. That's what I felt like. What are you sad about? I mean, you got all these good things in your life. What's there to be sad about? And you don't realize that it's a truly a mental condition that you just can't get over that easily. And once I went through it and realized that it didn't matter what happened, I couldn't change that, at least not easily. So yeah, my outlook completely changed on that and people who would attempt suicide. I was one of those that believed that anybody who did it was completely selfish, couldn't understand why anybody would even consider it until I got to that point. And then you realize that sometimes you just hurt so bad you want it to go away at any cost. And, you're willing to do things because you're not in the right state of mind. And that's the whole thing, whether it be depression or whether it be suicide attempts or people who actually complete the job of suicide. It's all about the frame of mind that you're in right then, and you will never understand that until you've been there.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're in that frame of mind, you can sort of intellectually be aware of all the blessings in your life, but you just can't feel it. Like that, you just can't feel that anything is good or positive, and it's hard to move, it's hard to breathe, it's hard to do anything. So, yeah, I think you're exactly right about that, and I think I'm sorry that you went through such a dark time in your life, but I think that it's been a great blessing to the community that you've created through Hillbilly Horror Stories, the larger podcasting community, and for anyone that has the good luck to hear your voice and hear you talk about these things who's maybe been in those dark spaces themselves. I mean, thank God that you went through what you went through so that you can help the rest of us find a way through it. So that curse was a blessing not just for yourself, but for everybody, I think. And as we were just talking about, this idea that sometimes terrible things happen, but down the road you see that the wonderful things could only have grown out of the soil of these tragedies or these hard times. And I guess that's why they call it faith, right? Because human beings often don't have the perspective or the patience to anticipate the domino effects of events that occur around us. I mean, that's the conclusion I've come to anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
And speaking of domino effects, let's get back to Pap Anderson. So he'd put down those firm roots in Aberdeen, Washington, near Gray's Harbor. But then he stumbled upon what he saw as the opportunity of a lifetime. He made a trip to the redwoods of Northern California, where he discovered what he saw as the future of the logging business. There was an abundance of ancient timber that could be purchased at low prices. However, part of the reason for the affordable price point was a significant logistical challenge. Sure, you could buy the trees and at a great price by board foot, but challenges remained. How could you fell them, mill the timber into lumber, and then get it through the endless emerald moat of ancient redwood forest? Well, Anderson concluded that a mill could be located 17 miles from the coast, and lumber could be moved by railway to the docks and shipped both north and south. He knew he'd have to plan for the daily life of his loggers and mill workers, and so he selected an area where the soil was arable, and he could locate his workmen's homes near the railroad, giving them access to the mill and the company train, as well as the ability to have gardens and orchards. Pap saw his timber utopia, what would become the town of Andersonia, as both an economic opportunity and a social experiment. Of course, these were extremely rose-colored glasses through which to view the company towns of the turn of the 20th century Emerald Triangle timber industry. Now, guys, you're both native Kentuckians, or Jerry, I know you are. Tracy, are you from Kentucky all your life too? Well, there you go. So Jerry and Tracy, you're both native Kentuckians, so I'm sure you're more than just a little familiar with the notorious company towns of the coal industry, made pop culture famous to a lot of us by the Merle Travis song 16 Tons, which I used to sing with my dad in the truck on the way to the school bus every morning. It was our morning school commute ritual. And the lumber company towns of the Pacific Northwest at the turn of the 20th century were, what I've gathered and what I've read, not too dissimilar. Do you guys have any friends or family who are or were coal miners? And do you know anyone who's experienced what it's like to live in a company town?
I actually do not.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that I had relatives. They used to live up in Olive. Well, my mom's from Olive Hill. And I recall that she had spoken about that she had some families that did work in the coal mines, but I don't really remember any specifics about it. But God bless them. They're hard workers, I'll tell you. I don't know how they do it like they do it.
And fun fact, Olive Hill, where her mother lived, is where Tom T. Hall lived, the singer.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah, they were actually neighbors, like right next door to each other. My mom always told me that story, how that they used to babysit and each other and stuff like that. So I thought that was pretty cool. So
that is.
Yeah.
That is. I have a story kind of like that. My grandfather grew up in Stockton, California, which is where John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater's from. Mm-hmm. And then when he was in his middle years, my grandfather was a drummer in a Dixieland jazz band, and they used to play Dixieland at this one bar in Stockton, where John's mother, who was a single woman, would often go out. And so my grandfather got to know her because she was a regular at the bar when his band would play. And he says he remembers very clearly a night when she came up to him and said, "Yeah, my son just wrote this new song. I really like it." And he said, "Oh, yeah? What's it called?" And she said, "Who'll Stop the Rain?"
Yeah.
No way.
Right? Like, what a moment. It was in history. Like, it was the night of the day that John Fogerty back in Mom's Garage wrote "Who'll Stop the Rain." Yeah, exactly.
That's a great story. Great song.
Oh, man, I love Creedence.
Yeah, we do too.
Oh, same here. We got to see John last year.
Fantastic. He's wonderful live.
Oh my gosh, he's like, what is he, in his 70s? And you would think he's in his 30s. He was all over that stage. I mean, he was wonderful.
Yeah, he looks great, and you're right. He moves like a much younger man. I mean, I'm much younger than him. I think he moves better than I do.
I know he moves better than I do. That's for dang sure.
My one other personalized this moment in music history happened to me. I think it was probably 2007 New Year's Eve, and I went to this little Irish bar in Los Angeles called Molly Malone's to see my friend's bluegrass rock band called the Lincoln Bedroom.
Nice.
And opening for the Lincoln Bedroom was this group that I didn't know anything about, and they were all dressed in matching suits like the Temptations. There were horn players. That everybody danced like Michael Jackson. It was the most mind-blowingly awesome show I'd ever seen, and I watched it in probably a 700 square foot room about 25 feet from the stage. And probably 2 weeks after that, when he all of a sudden became massively famous, I realized that I'd just seen Bruno Mars.
Oh, nice.
Oh, my gosh. That is so awesome.
Completely,
oh, my gosh.
Completely blew my mind. And he was opening for my buddy's, like, folk rock band.
That's awesome.
Okay, I digress. Let's get back to Pap Anderson. He located the mill, this utopian sawmill dream of his, in an area where Percy Creek empties into the Eel River, about 17.5 miles from the coast. And he quickly went to work constructing a dam 32 feet high and 80 feet across to form a mill pond capable of holding 20 million board feet of logs. I mean, this was not a guy for half measures. If he was going to build a logging town and build a sawmill to cut down these giant trees, he was going to do it all the way. I don't know if have you guys ever visited Northern California? Are you familiar with redwood trees at all?
No, the furthest I think either one of us has been is Las Vegas.
Well, Vegas is fun. Well, I grew up amongst the redwoods, and they really are remarkable. They can be the oldest ones can be as much as 40 feet in diameter, over 300 feet tall, and they can be 5,000 years old.
Wow.
So if you cut down a redwood tree that old, and you know how trees have rings, right, that show how much they've grown in any particular year. They grow a lot more in mild years, less if there's a forest fire or a drought or something. But you can actually mark like the entirety of recorded human history.
That's amazing.
It really blows my mind. It's like here's Sophocles, here's the birth of Christ, here's the Crusades, and you can go all the way from the dawn of things to now.
Incredible.
They're living time capsules. So he builds this incredible setup. He laid out railroad connecting the mill to the coastal port at Bear Harbor, and he had his workmen build 14 massive trestles to span the narrow valleys and gulches along the route from Andersonia to Bear Harbor. Now, railroad activity at Bear Harbor was nothing new, and here again, although he may not have realized it, as before in Grays Harbor, Washington, Pap Anderson benefited from the dominoes that fell as the result of another man's unfortunate demise. In 1882, C.C. Milton had begun building wharves at Bear Harbor for the shipping of tan bark and railroad ties. But in 1884, he unexpectedly drowned at Rockport, California, and construction was halted. I suppose it may have been redundant to say unexpectedly drowned, as though because no one ever
expects to drown.
Yeah, no one expects to drown, right? I mean, and although no one ever hopes for drownings, if one does occur, you have to hope that it's unexpected, right? Because otherwise it's murder.
That's correct. Or just dumb luck.
Right. By July of 1885, Dr. W.A. McCormick of Mendocino resumes work on the wharves and the timber chute. And to fast forward a little, in 1892, other business interests acquire the wharves and 12,000 acres of timber, and they order their very first steam engine, engine number 1, from San Francisco. And then a year later, over 2 miles of track was in use, and by 1889, they get their second engine, creatively named engine number 2, and a plan was set to run railroad all the way from Bear Harbor to the town of Garberville. Now, all of this occurred while Pap was busy lumbering in Michigan and Washington, but it seems clear that the death of C.C. Milton set off a flurry of economic opportunity that would make Pap's dream of Andersonia possible. In case anyone is keeping track, Pap Anderson's destiny has been defined by 2 deaths so far. So far. Dun dun dun. By 1902, Anderson and Middleton had arrived on the scene in Mendocino County, just south of the Humboldt border, and they incorporated the Southern Humboldt Lumber Company with capital stock of $500,000. By this time, Anderson himself was a millionaire. Man, how'd you like to have $1 million in 1905?
I don't even. Golly.
Really?
It's hard to believe there would be such a thing in that year.
I know.
I know. Well, you'd be like royalty.
Absolutely. I mean, my grandfather, I remember him telling me his first job in Stockton that we were just talking about. He was 18, so it would have been 1938. And he would work all day in the blazing hot sun digging potatoes for 50 cents a day. And that's,
oh my gosh.
That's 1938. So that'll give you some idea what a $1 million in 1905 must have been able to get you.
Yeah.
So by February of 1905, the sawmill was built, filled with the absolute cutting edge, pun intended, of logging machinery, shipped and then transported via mule cart, I guess, from the East Coast by Pap Anderson at great expense and logistical challenge. Andersonia, his timber utopia, had been laid out over 40 acres in all, 17.5 miles by covered wagon road from the town of Garberville, because there were no cars yet. It included a general store, a post office, a saloon, a cookhouse, a bunkhouse, a railway depot, and everything needed for a full-grown logging town. As construction was completed, Pap recruited his crew from Grays Harbor and other northern logging companies, even as far away as the home state of his first logging operation, Michigan. Michigander, there's my favorite word again, William Lilly, made a trip to Northern California to become the foreman of Southern Humboldt Lumber Company, and stood in Andersonia, mouth agape, just trying to make sense of the largest trees he had ever seen. Truly untouched, virgin old-growth forests. I've seen some old photos. By the time there were actual logging trucks like we're maybe all familiar with, essentially flatbed Mack trucks, you could only fit 1 tree on an entire truck.
Wow. Now, those aren't the trees that they've got them carved out where you can drive a truck through or a car through or something like that?
That's exactly right. That drive-through tree, the famous one, is not too far from this town of Andersonia that I'm telling you guys all about.
Okay,
so
cool.
You're exactly on point there, Tracy.
Good. It would seem like it would take forever to, get all those trees over there if they could only do one at a time.
Yeah, well, I think it did take a long time, but there was so much money in it that many hands make short work, I guess. And also, as I sort of alluded to when I mentioned that he dammed the river to create a mill pond, very often they would use a lot of water for the transport. You'd essentially dump all the logs into the pond and then run them down the river for as long as you can to get where you're going.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
As you said, besides trees this big, I mean, they were nearly impossible to transport. And that was why when he first arrived in the Emerald Triangle, you could get a pretty good deal on very valuable timber because everybody was like, well, yeah, it's here, but how the heck am I supposed to get it out of here and sell it? So one day in the fall of 1905, everything was ready. Pap's sons and son-in-law Bert had arrived, and toward the end of October of that year, Pap announced that the mill at Andersonia would cut its first log. It had been a race against time to make sure everything was ready. Much of the scaffolding and staging was still up, but the saws had been lined up, the carriage tested, and the live rolls were working. The live rolls are when they cut a big round off the log, it would drop onto essentially like a conveyor belt, sort of like when you're going through security at the airport, and that would roll the log into the mill to be cut by the giant saw blades. So everything was up and running.
Cool.
A huge crowd had gathered. When Pap Anderson roared, "Start her up!" and the first redwood log came up the slip, soaking wet and heavy with perfect wood. Anderson took a position behind the saws to watch, his eyes sparkling with anticipation as the first blades bit into that gargantuan tree. Sawdust flew as the steel cut deep, slicing a thick round of wood from the tree. The round fell. The off-bearer stuck his picaroon in the round, landed up on the rolls, and the round began to slide smoothly toward the mill for sawing into lumber. Everything was going perfectly. Pap was thrilled to witness the first moments of the birth of his Emerald Triangle logging empire. And then, with all the horrible inevitability of a scene from the film series Final Destination, the cable used to demolish the staging from the construction work caught on a brace in the structure of the mill. It tore the brace loose, and that impossibly heavy brace tumbled high overhead like the sword of Damocles, hanging above the skull of visionary Pap Anderson, the very man whose vision and perseverance, whose dreams made reality, had created this exact moment. The brace struck Pap Anderson where he stood. He hung on for a hopeless week and died. Yeah.
So, Pap had a horrible thing happen to him, but look what he created.
Right.
And if it would have missed him, it would have been a mispap.
Oh boy.
Oh Lord.
Oh, I love it.
Every day, 7, every day.
A master of dad jokes. Yeah. That's last week when I was on with my buddy Nick View, who's from Michigan. I asked him, I said, so if you're a Michigander, does that mean your wife or any other woman from Michigan would be a Michigoose?
That's what I was going to say a while ago.
Nice.
When you made that comment, I was going to say, what's good for the Michigoose is good for the Michigander.
Yeah. It was
That's
funny.
awesome.
He didn't have much of a sense of humor about it. He was like, no one's ever said that.
Oh, Lord.
I mean, not really. He was playing with me, but I think, it is people from Michigan like that word even more than I do, so.
But I have never even heard of that Michigander.
Oh, yeah.
Have you, Jared?
Yeah, and they like.
I haven't.
They like that just as much as throwing up their hand to show you where they live. That's always a given. Where do you live at? Well, if you go, it's like.
Oh.
We don't do that. We don't. Let's try to make the shape of Kentucky.
That's hilarious.
See.
That's really, as if like a map of Michigan is just imprinted in everyone else's hand. That's pretty funny. Oh my gosh. So when Pap dies, all the work at his timber utopia of Andersonia ceased, and it remained ceased. Some 31 years later, on April 18th.
What?
Yeah. It stood as a sort of ghostly monument to what could have been for a long time. 31 years later, on April 18th, 1936, In the Mendocino Beacon, a writer named C.A. King recounted a story written by George J. Tooby of the Humboldt Times. And it was C.A. King's recounting where I first discovered this story of Andersonia. The story King tells is a brief overview of the one I've just told you, but with the added perspective of 31 years gone by, King and Tooby's recounting of the dark fate of Pap Anderson and Andersonia includes new, decidedly creepy, and decidedly paranormal details. The first is that the brand new machinery in the Andersonia mill remained brand new and sparkling 31 years later, despite the perpetual fog and forest damp. When one entered the ghost town of Andersonia in 1936, everything outside was ancient, and everything inside sparkling new, as if to underscore the point that the mill never milled so much as a tree from those south fork of the Eel River forests. The second creepy thing is a railroad station, standing there with only 100 feet of track that disappears into a gully. And yet, local hunters report finding pieces of railroad rail miles from any civilization, and many miles from Andersonia itself, as though flung impossible distances by a raging Sasquatch or some other sylvan protector. And lastly, ranchers living near Andersonia report that on certain windy nights, the ghost of Pap Anderson comes down from the tall mill stacks, eternally furious at the frustration of his Herculean dream. He haunts Andersonia and spends stormy nights whimpering tear-streaked rage into the mill's massive, unused boilers. And Andersonia is not only haunted, it may also very well be cursed. Immediately after Anderson's death, his sons in the timber business didn't want to leave Washington to work Andersonia. Then litigation developed among Anderson's young wife and his many heirs. At first, there were many interested buyers, in particular a man named Trumbull, who went to San Francisco in 1906 to finalize the details of his purchase of Andersonia. Well, Trumbull arrived in San Francisco only to live through the 1906 earthquake and massive fire. But the experience of his survival was so traumatic, he became embittered with California and left forever, never to return. That's one purchase of Andersonia thwarted. The next prospective buyer was a man named Hicks, who had trouble securing the funds to buy Andersonia and became so despondent by this failure that he took his own life. Hicks' partners, because Hicks was the lead man on the purchase, declined to buy the mill themselves. Then, by 1939, the timber holdings associated with Andersonia had continued to increase in value, and curse or ghost or no, a man named Barnum, a name associated with many a great hoodwinking, resolved to reopen the mill at Andersonia. But a short decade later, work that once again had never really started was halted as the company was in receivership and facing lawsuits. Then, in October 15th of 1975, almost 70 years to the day since the death of Pap Anderson, a company called Andersonia Forest Products was established in Arcata, California. But a short 9 years later in 1984, its license was suspended by the California Secretary of State. And that's the last I know of Andersonia. Although I believe its first locomotive, nicknamed Gypsy, has been preserved and can be seen at the Fort Humboldt Logging Museum. And the ruins of Andersonia can still be visited and viewed, if you're brave enough.
Wow.
Sounds like a fun place.
Yeah, well, it definitely sounded cursed, that's for sure. Man.
I'll admit, I wanted to choose a paranormal story today because, you guys are the absolute masters of telling paranormal stories, and I hoped that if I could do an okay job of telling a scary story, that maybe there would be a Hillbilly Horror Stories listener tuning into my show that might decide to stick around. So,
Oh, of course, of course. That was really an interesting story too.
Yeah, I think most of your stories would keep our listeners interested. I know you've
Oh,
got
yeah.
quite a few listeners over the last year or so.
Yeah, definitely.
well, that's very kind of you to say. I very recently have gotten a big increase in listenership. Our mutual friend Darren Marlar from Weird Darkness was very kind in promoting my show on his. And I think also that I finally have sort of cracked how my show ought to go. I mean, I'm sure you guys can speak to this, but I've been doing it for just a little bit over a year now, and feels like there's quite a learning curve. One thinks you can just kind of hop on a mic and do things, but it takes a darn while to learn what you're doing at all.
Well, that's the truth, especially for me. Like I just was kind of hopped in and had no clue how to do anything, and probably still to this day really don't. Just kind of listen and put my 2 cents in. But it's a lot. It's a lot to do, and it's a lot to learn. And we definitely have made our mistakes for sure. And you just kind of got to learn from it and move on, and you'll get there.
Yeah, that's good advice. I feel like an important thing to remember in this modern world we live in today, where I feel like everyone is conditioned to just kind of succeed right away or think that they should. All the articles are always 40 under 40, 30 under 30. Mm-hmm. It's never like 60 people who put in a lifetime's worth of hard work and became mega experts and are now really successful. We're absolutely in love with the idea of sort of hitting the one-armed bandit jackpot immediate success. And so with something that takes as much work as podcasting, it can sometimes be hard to remember that you've just, you got to put the time in.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's important to keep in mind, though, is the reason those 40 under 40 and 30 under 30 type stories are so big is because that's not the norm. That's what makes them a story.
Right. That's a great point. Well, Jerry, Tracy, do you guys have a story that maybe you want to share with the listeners here? Give them a little break
really.
from me.
No. We're tired of telling stories. We do that. We thought this was just going to be a break for us. We didn't realize that we had to work on our off day.
You're silly.
I actually have a story. It's in my book, and I've told this story on Jim Harold's show, which is wildly popular, his Campfires show. And he actually said at the time, and he's been doing this for, I think, 13 years now, he said at the time that this was his favorite story at that point. Now, he's probably had some since then, but I'll start with this story because it's my favorite story to tell, and it's one that changed my life.
I can't wait.
Okay, so we're going to go back and a little bit of a backstory. My mother passed away in 2007, and she was only 54 years old. It was an unexpected death. She went into the hospital for something that we thought was going to be, no big deal, and then she didn't make it past the next day. My mother and I did not have the greatest relationship up to this point. There was a lot of, I don't know, it's just we used to be really close when I was younger, and at the time of my teen years, we kind of started getting a little more distant, started having those typical teenager and parent confrontations. And it just seemed like as I got older and moved out of the house, got married and had kids, that relationship never really was repaired. And it would be frustrating and somewhat to the point to where I'm ashamed at the way I conducted myself. As I was older, in the years before she passed away, there were times where I would go over the house and visit my dad. She would be in a back room and I wouldn't even go back there or say hi. She would call and I wouldn't pick up the phone because I saw it was her. Or I'd rush her off the phone when I did talk to her.
So I imagine that made her passing very extra painful for you.
It did. There was a lot of guilt, obviously, because I didn't expect her. She didn't have a terminal illness or anything, and I obviously wasn't expecting her to pass away. But I didn't have that perspective until after the fact. And at this time, I was doing stand-up comedy, and we're about 6 months past her death. And I'm at this little hole-in-the-wall bar. I mean, I bet if it was wall-to-wall with people, there probably couldn't have been 50 people in the place. It had 2 rooms. The main room was the bar, and then it had a step-down room with seating for about 25, 30 people that they would do karaoke and what have you in there. And they allowed us to do a comedy show one night, and it was me and a gentleman named Chuck. So I've had nothing else to do that day. I get there a couple of hours before the show. I've got my notes on paperwork. I'm just kind of going over my routine. And it's about this time that this quintessential biker and his girlfriend come into the bar. When I say stereotypical, I mean stereotypical. I mean, they both had the leather on. He was probably about 6'1", 6'2", big burly beard, burly hair, had the bandana on, and kind of a rough looking guy. And she was kind of the same way as far as on the woman's side, minus the beard. She didn't have a beard, but she was, she had a couple of scars on her face, and she was probably late 40s. He was probably late 40s. But anyway, so they come in, super nice people, and we're talking, and they find out I'm a comedian. I ask them, hey, are you guys staying for the show? Well, they had no idea there was going to be a comedy show, which it's not like there was a big billboard outside or anything. Mm-hmm. And, they said they might hang around. They were basically stopping here before they went to a couple other bars. And, I sat there and talked to them a little bit, chit chat, small talk, nothing major. They obviously don't know me. I don't know them. Mm-hmm. And we're probably about an hour from the show. I decide I'm going to go into that little step down room where the show's going to be, so I can go over my notes. It'd be a little quieter in there. As I'm sitting in there, they come in and sit down across the room from me. But I see them sitting there, and I'm like, I feel bad because they're sitting all by themselves, and I'm in the room. I don't want them to think I'm ignoring them. So I felt obligated to go over there and talk to them, which I really didn't want to do because I really wanted to go over my notes.
Prep, yeah.
Right. And so I go over and start talking to them, and literally within a minute and a half of us sitting down, the man says, well, your mom just wants you to know that everything will be okay. So initially I'm thinking this is some kind of joke that I missed because they were crying. He was telling me jokes in the other room because anytime somebody finds out you're a comedian, the first thing I'm going to do is tell you jokes.
Prove they're funny too.
Which is odd because when I find out that people work at McDonald's, I don't ask them to come in the kitchen and let me start flipping burgers for them so they can see my technique. But people do that different when you're a comedian. So anyways, I'm sitting down and they say, well, your mom just wants you to know that everything's okay. So I did the little fake awkward laugh, thinking I missed a joke. And the young lady reaches over, she puts her hand right on top of my hand and said, no, your mom really wants you to know that everything is okay. And in that moment, I literally broke down. I have a hard time telling this story without breaking down at that same point. And matter of fact, we did a live event in Memphis last year, I think in October, and I literally broke down on stage and had to wait before I could finish because it's just as many times as I've written this story and told this story, which has been a bunch, the emotion never goes away from it. But I lost it to the point to where I knew that she was there. I knew that they were there for a reason that I had no clue about. And I wasn't sure if they had a clue about. And so we just started talking about it. And I said, we didn't have the best relationship and there was a lot of guilt and I explained some of the stuff already that I explained to you about, not answering phone calls and all that. And they said, yeah, but she knows that. And she just wants you to know that everything's completely fine. That's not something that you need to worry about. It's not something that needs to be on your mind, that, all is basically forgiven. And I said, yeah, I that's a load off of my shoulders to be able to hear that. And then they just went on to start talking about other stuff like, well, she feels like that you should be doing, bigger and better things than, like being at this little bar tonight and all this stuff. And my mom saw me perform one time. It was at the Comedy Caravan up in Louisville, which was the biggest nightclub or the comedy club in that area. And matter of fact, Tom Sobel owned that club for the longest time. He owned it for like 30 years, and he's the gentleman that founded Gallagher and some other big names out there. So that was, his agent and all that. So he was a pretty big name in the comedy business. And So my mom did see me perform once, and, my comedy career really was just starting about the time that she saw me. As a matter of fact, I think it was my second performance ever, and I was still only like probably less than a year into it. So, a lot of growing to still do. I really didn't deserve to be anywhere other than a place like I was that night. But, and they kept saying some things to me. But to be honest with you, I don't remember much after that moment. I was so overcome with emotion that, I don't remember much about that night after that. Not the show, not anything. I mean, I performed and I guess I did okay. But, I at that moment just completely changed my life, because even though I grew up in a haunted house and I knew in my heart that there were spirits and life went on, this was my proof. This was my undoubtedly proof that there is a life and that my mom was still out there. And she was willing to send somebody in there somehow, some way to give me this message. And they would have had no clue. They would have had no clue. And then right after that, they got up and left, and I've never seen them since. So, these two bikers randomly walk into a bar and start telling me stuff about my mom. And, that's a story that you can't write. I mean, how does that happen? I don't know if they were angels, or, I don't know if they even knew that, I don't know if they've ever been used like that since then, but they were sent there for a reason.
Yeah. Wow. That's an amazing story. I'm misty-eyed myself. I don't know if you can see me sort of biting my lips, but, wow. So do you think that she channeled through them to speak to you, and that it's likely that the biker and his girlfriend don't have any memory of it themselves? Or do you think that there was something more intentional to it on their side as well? Like maybe this is something they've done for people before because they somehow have that sixth sense or something?
I have no clue. I have no clue whatsoever. I mean, it could have been a situation where they walked out of that bar and it's like, what the hell just happened? Maybe they didn't have a clue. It was just a spur of the moment thing. I have no idea. I did figure out, though, years later, and it never made this connection. The little bar was called Red Eyes, and it was a little hole in the wall. I mean, literally a hole in the wall to sit on a corner of on these two little quiet roads. So you had to want to get there. And I remember that my mom, myself, and my dad rarely did anything by ourselves. But a couple of years before she passed away, the last thing that we did all do together was we went to that little bar and shot pool. And I didn't remember that until literally probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Wow. And that just happens to be the place she showed up, and maybe that was a connection that I didn't draw.
Wow, that's amazing. And is your father still alive, or was he still alive at the time?
No, he is. He's still alive.
Yeah. Wow, that's really I've got the goosies, Jerry. That's quite a story.
Well, I've got the ganders, so.
And we brought it full circle. Yay. Oh my gosh, that is I can see why that's Jim Harold's favorite story, and now it's one of mine as well. What a remarkable tale. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
You're welcome.
So, guys, Hillbilly Horror Stories, do you guys have any upcoming events? Don't you have a cruise planned? Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
We do. We have a extra large rowboat, so there's room for 3. If anybody wants to get on, it'd be right down the Ohio River. We're actually it should be fine. It's through Royal Caribbean. And it's going to be from Miami to the Bahamas. It's a 4-day cruise. It takes off September 19th and goes to the 23rd. And last I checked, we had over 200 people already booked to come aboard. So It's going to be fun. It's going to be us and 3 other podcasts that are going to be there. Mysterious Circumstances, the Brohio podcast, and the Shane Waters podcast. Drew a blank completely at the thing, but it's going to be a complete blast. We're going to have one day where we're going to be doing a live show with all 4 podcasts, and the Foul Play podcast.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, I just googled. Yeah, Foul Play. Got it.
Yeah, the Foul Play
podcast. That sounds so fun.
And And Shane, by the way, Shane is big time. I mean, big time. This guy, he helped solve some of the redheaded murder cases that was in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky,
Oh my
I think
goodness.
Indiana. But there was some cases back in the 70s where there were a bunch of redheaded women of the night, we'll say, ladies of the evening, that went missing, and they found their bodies, but they couldn't rectify who they were. They never could find the names for these people. And Shane went through and actually helped find the identities of 2 or 3 of these young women here
Wow.
recently. So, and he's spoken at CrimeCon. He's closed down CrimeCon, the Netflix television show, The Followers. He was one of the writers or researchers, I should say, for that. And they're doing a sequel he's going to be a part of. Yeah, Shane is big time. He's a 30-year-old guy that's about 6'8",
Whoa.
6'9". He is and has the heart of a teddy bear.
Oh my gosh, he is. He's an amazing person, just as nice as he can be, and we're just so proud of him for what he's accomplished. It's a lot.
That's remarkable.
So
That sounds like
yeah,
a
he's
great
amazing.
cruise.
Mm-hmm.
Hillbillyhorrorstories.com. We have a tab on there that's completely dedicated to the cruise. It has all the information, the travel agent to call. It's got all the videos and prices of rooms and everything. But this thing starts, you can get in with 2 people in an interior room for like $900. And that includes all your food and a couple of different stops that we do out there. And then the live show that we do. It's going to be a fun time.
Gosh, that sounds fantastic. I might have to go book some tickets for myself and my family right now. What a
You should. That'd
cruise.
be
What a
great.
cruise.
You should, really.
It'd be super fun. All right. Well, hey, yeah, I should. I've got to run it by the family accountant first. But if she says okay, maybe we'll see you there. Well, Jerry,
That would be great.
it sure would. I would love it. So, Jerry, Tracy, thank you so much for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure to share this time with you and share stories. Jerry, I'm honestly still a little bit moved by your story. I was thinking all about the cursed and haunted story that I told, and now I hardly remember it because I'm just thinking about that moment with you and the bikers in the bar and what that must have been like. Man, thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Well, it's Hillbilly Horror Stories, everybody. A fantastic podcast available anywhere you get your pods. You can go to hillbillyhorrorstories.com. You can book tickets to the cruise. They've got some fantastic merch there. They've got announcements about upcoming live shows. I love the show. I love Jerry and Tracy. They've been amazing friends and mentors to me on my podcast journey. Please engage with them. Subscribe to their show. You'll be so happy you did. And again, Jerry and Tracy, thank you so much for being here. For Jerry and Tracy Paulley, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
Kinda Murdery, The Emerald Triangle, is created, researched, edited, produced, and hosted by Zevin Odelberg, with opening theme by Niall Madden and art by the Gin of Lang. Available now on all podcasting platforms. If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.